Welcome to the Red Gauge Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle. Today, we're going to continue our Fundamental Principles of Training series with Dr. Greg Haff. We're going to talk about periodization. So this is going to be an introduction, and we'll dip our toes into some of the things that are worth mentioning, but we're going to talk a little bit about what periodization is, what it isn't, what some easy mistakes to avoid are, and what some low-hanging fruit is for taking advantage of the strategy. So thanks so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be on your podcast again.
Yeah. I had a great time last time, so I was really excited about it. I bought your book, your last book from 2024, Scientific Foundations and Practical Principles of Periodization. So I was hoping I'd have the whole thing read before you got on, but it's been a pretty chaotic week, so I didn't
And
get the
it's
whole
pretty
thing
long. It's pretty in-depth.
read. So, do you want to take us through a little bit of like the history of periodization? Like, what is the idea, and how did we run into it?
This is a really interesting discussion point because it's one that we've been having a lot within the scientific community, that there's a group of people that seem to think that periodization just kind of magically began with Matveev in the 1950s.
Uh-huh.
And it was only for strength training. And this is a really perplexing line of reasoning to me, because we can find actual indications of periodization theory in ancient antiquity,
Yeah.
with the Romans preparing for combat and having a tetrad and leading in stages into preparation for a military engagement. And so, in fact, periodization probably has its roots in military preparation, which is an interesting phenomenon that we've recently discovered in the historical literature. And if we look at over time, there's been this evolution of the theory. It's not like it's magically just appeared. It's like we've learned, oh, we have to do things in a seasonal way. Well, we saw that with Ficcola. We saw that with some work in the early 1900s, where we're talking about this idea that we've got to think about things in a phasical manner. And really, the reason that Matveev gets so much credit is he's the first one to kind of put it into a major concept, because it was his doctoral dissertation. But what people have to realize is that Nadore was working on it at the same time. We've also had Bondarchuk working on concepts of related to periodization from a different perspective. But there are through lines with all the theories of periodization, and that was just in the Eastern Bloc countries, but also in England there was people working on periodization, and in the United States as well. One of the ones that I often look back to is some of the 1930s and the German work, which is what was quite fascinating as well. So one of the things that we have to think about is that periodization is an evolution of our thinking about how to deliver training. Not just resistance training, but preparations for something. So I think one of the biggest pitfalls that people make is thinking that periodization is simply the resistance training program.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably where people get themselves a little bit confused. And where I often talk about with my students is that they actually conflate periodization and programming. Those are very interrelated concepts, but
Yep.
they're quite different.
Yep.
And I think this is where some of the confusion actually arises. And when we start to think about that, we have to kind of differentiate between the two. And I think that's the biggest thing that we should probably start with if we really want to understand periodization.
Yeah, and I think that it's really valuable to think about, like, just to point out the historical perspective of where we get to with the training process, because a lot of them kind of almost become self-evident to you if you're really serious about training. Like, at some point in your training career, you're going to realize, like, I can't get bigger at the same time as I'm focusing on maximal power, and I can't ride two horses with one ass all the time, right? You run into limits for what you can do really effectively. And so if you have some brilliant idea where you're like, hey, you know what would be really good is if I organized my training interventions so that I could, get the most benefit and, progress my training. It's always worthwhile to go back and look at what other people have done, because you'll save yourself a lot of time and mistakes and heartache in, making those basic mistakes that you could have just circumvented in the first place.
Oh, absolutely. I am a very big advocate of the fact that we should be looking backwards before we look forward. And one of the things I'm going to fault universities for this. We have this basic belief in universities that if it's not within the last 5 years, it's outdated and it's old. And I think that's a really, really big mistake. And it's creating a lot of young sports science and strength and conditioning students who think they're, coming up with these revolutionary new concepts that are old as it is time.
Hmm.
One that I often see a lot of people talk about right now is autoregulation.
Yeah.
Autoregulation of the training process is like the buzzword of the day. Well, I can tell you that in 1916, in the seminal text Olympic Sport, Kotov talks about autoregulation of training.
Right.
And he talks about it, how you shouldn't use it with novice athletes
Uh-huh.
and that it should only be used with the very advanced athletes.
Well,
But he puts a caveat on there: training is always better guided by the coach.
yeah.
And and that makes me laugh because I see these papers. We're the first to look at this. No, you're not. You just haven't looked back far enough.
Yeah, you didn't set
And
your lit review back far enough.
yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to credit Professor Mike Stone for teaching me this lesson. I know when I studied with him, I was interested in carbohydrates and fueling and resistance training, and I said, well, where do I start? And he threw a paper from 1936 on my desk. He goes, this would be a good place to start.
Hmm.
And I'm like, okay. And then he made me actually read every paper on carbohydrate supplementation and fueling from 1936 to 1994.
Yeah, I mean,
And
which is great.
I hated him at the time because it's like, there's a lot of reading, but in hindsight, it actually gave me a framework to work from. So I really think we have to always look backwards, and there's so much great work. And to be honest, one of the beauties of Gen AI at the moment is we can actually translate some of these classic books that are in foreign languages that we historically might not have been able to read.
Hmm.
And so I think that's an interesting conundrum. But periodization has got a rich history. It is really a mix of work done by coaches who, like you said, have the practical experience. My athlete's not getting better. Let's try this, and then they work their way through it. It isn't until the 19 probably 70s, 80s in the Western literature where people started to look more scientifically at it. In the strength training space, but not holistically always in the sporting context. A lot of people don't realize that the seminal paper by Stone, Garhammer, and O'Brien from 1981 was actually done with football teams at high schools, at separate high schools. And it wasn't just about the strength training. They looked at everything.
Hmm.
But everyone just dials in on the strength training. And so for me, periodization is a more holistic kind of thing. And I think if you read my book, I talk about that in a quite a lot of detail about looking at it from a real global perspective. That periodization is a goal setting and target setting kind of construct. So I'm outlining what I need to accomplish, for example, in an annual training plan. And I know the grounding point on that for most athletes is their competitive season, because it really doesn't matter how strong you are on Instagram if you're a strength athlete. It matters at the national and world championships.
I've been doing it wrong the whole time.
Well, it's funny to me because I look at a lot of weightlifters and strength athletes, and you see these massive lifts on Instagram, and then you see them in competition, and it's nowhere near. And so I think that's about timing and preparing the athlete to do well when they need to. But I think one of the other things that people get confused with periodization is it's not a guarantee.
Hmm.
I look at it as it's a plan to increase the probability of success, in the sense that I'm trying to outline training so that at the Olympics, let's say, I have my best opportunity to be successful.
Hmm.
Now, the human is wonderfully good at screwing things up as far as, letting their psychology mess up their physiology, in the sense that getting nervous, getting scared, getting self-doubt and things like that. But if we've trained correctly, we've embedded psychological training
Hmm.
into that global periodization modeling. My good friend, Dr. Inigo Mujika's paper on periodization is a really good one that he wrote with Shauna Halson and Louise Burke and several others, where they talk about it's not just the training, the physical, it's the psychological, it's the nutrition, it's the recovery, and it's also the motor learning, thinking of things in motor development over time as well.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it, periodization does align with long-term athlete development as well. So, the goals of a novice athlete who's just starting, their annual plan looks very different than an elite athlete who's going to the Olympics.
Yeah.
And so it's a very individualized construct.
Yeah. So I have like a million little questions and comments to make, but before we get into that, let's talk about like just broadly, what is the goal when we're doing periodization? Like, what is it that we should be thinking about when we're actually thinking about periodization? And then we can contrast that a little bit because, as you mentioned earlier, people often conflate periodization with programming. We hear, linear periodization, block periodization,
Uh,
conjugate periodization. They're all programming styles that we use to carry out the
yeah,
periodization, model that we want. So how do we talk
yeah.
about periodization? Like, what can we do with it? Why is it in our toolkit? And then how do we talk about, the programming pieces separately from that?
So the way I look at it is periodization is a directional goal. It's like the Google Earth. It's like, where am I trying to go?
Hmm.
And if I look at it from the frame of Google Earth, let's say that I'm trying to get from, I don't know, New York to Boston. Okay, my goal is to get from New York to Boston.
Hmm.
I can get from New York to Boston in many ways. And that's kind of programming. I could walk, it's going to take a while. I could ride a bike, I could take a train, fly. So when I think about it, periodization is that global direction that has our goals, our targeted points in time when we need to try to perform our best, and that informs my programming decisions. My programming decisions are how I'm going to accomplish those goals and achieve the plan that I've outlined. Now, there are many, many, many programming strategies that we can use. And the programming strategies are infinitely malleable to the athlete's emerging state. But if you think about it, it doesn't matter how good I feel on the Olympic gold medal day, I still have to compete.
Hmm.
And so I have some staticness to the competitive schedule. So like we're getting ready for college football season. It's a good time of year. What we know in the schedule is it's been pre-planned for over a year.
Right.
So it's all set out. And so we know where we have competitions. Like I know, for example, when Texas plays Texas A&M, that's going to be a big game. So I've got to put specific programming strategies in to ensure that my team, whichever team it is ready to play.
Yeah. And there's a lot of value judgments to be made along that process, right? Like you mentioned, the Texas A&M game. That's going to be a big thing. But like, let's say that you want to go to. I mean, that's a great example. Like going to the Olympics is a great example. If you want to go to the Olympics, sometimes that means you have to make it through the Olympic trials. And some of our athletes put up bigger numbers in the Olympic trials than they do at the Olympics because they had to make it through that gate to get to the second
Yeah,
performance. So when we're trying to decide, like, do we want to perform for a season, do we want to perform for a weekend, like those are different requirements, right?
absolutely. So yeah, actually, getting peak performance for a one-off competition is a very different strategy than trying to optimize performance for a season. You have to kind of look at it in the context of you really can't hold a true peak for very long. It's roughly about 8 to 12 days max.
Hmm.
You might be able to stretch it a little bit longer in some sports, but if you look at the meta-analytic data, it's about 8 to 12 days. And so I've got to start to manipulate my programming so that I get my recovery supercompensation somewhere between those 8 and 12 days. So that's why you see sometimes, like in sports like swimming in the Olympics, they start to get better over the rounds because they're starting to move into the more peaked zone
Hmm.
potentially if the taper's correct. Now, a sport like American football, or even worse, would be like basketball, NBA,
Yeah,
or
baseball,
women's
160
NBA.
game season.
They have really, really long seasons. So you have to basically optimize training throughout the year. So that means that you have to manipulate training variables in a way that accounts for, let's say I have a week that's a bye week. We've got to have to resaturate the system with some training to get fitness back in. Or if they're injured, we have to manage that injury with recovery, etc. So we've got this. You can't really just say, "Oh, I'm going to peak for the first game of the season. I'm going to hold it for the whole season."
Wouldn't that
If
be
you
great?
truly it'd be wonderful. But if you truly peak for the first game of the season, you'll be losing within 4 games because your physical capacities are going to decline because a true peak, physical capacities are starting to get to the point where they decline.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a really interesting thing about peaking, just as, a piece of periodization, right? Is that we train for a long time to improve our fitness, and then we start switching gears towards performance. And once we make that switch, our fitness starts going down, right? And
correct.
so the juice that you get from that isn't infinite. That because that fitness will keep decaying, right?
Correct. Because we're really looking at what's called the preparedness line.
Hmm.
And that's basically a composite of the fatigue that you've generated and the fitness that you've generated. So it's often talked about in the context of what's called the fatigue fitness paradigm. So training actually increases fitness, but the harder the training, the more fatigue you have. So
Hmm.
you mask that fitness gain. However, we know that fatigue, dissipates at a two-thirds quicker rate than fitness. So we can manipulate training variables to maintain performance and see a reduction in fatigue. And that's really how we look at getting that athlete super compensated for competition. Now, I will highlight, if you look at the tapering peaking literature, it is very, very individualized, the
Yes.
strategies that have to be employed. There are some athletes that are very, very rapid detrainers. My wife worked with a famous athlete here in Australia named Ash Brazel, who's a netball player and a women's AFL player. And to be honest, I've worked with many athletes. I have never seen an athlete detrain as fast as she does when she's out
Yeah.
of the weight room. She loses strength at a rapid rate, but on the flip side, she also gains it at a rapid rate. And so her strategies are very different than someone who holds strength relatively easily. And so I think you have to kind of know your athletes there. In talking to, not talking to, but also seeing some talks by Inigo Majika, he actually did some studies on twins in triathlons. Like he coached two brothers. Each one used a very different tapering strategy. And they were identical twins. So you would, genetically, they should be quite similar. Um, and so those strategies are programming strategies in my mind. They're not really periodization. Periodization tells me when I need to do that. Where in the year do I need to peak?
Hmm.
And what strategies am I, what's my targeted outcomes to lead me from where I am to where I need to be? So periodization has a degree of forecasting of performance. And this is where I think generative AI is going to play a big role in the future, is helping us forecast our athletes' performance targeting. Um, David Martin did a wonderful talk in 2004 about Anna Mears, the track cyclist, and they had forecasted her training leading into the Athens Olympics. And they noticed about 8 months before the games that she was tracking too quickly towards her performance target, which suggested she would basically peak her performance before the Olympics.
Yeah.
So by monitoring athletes' progress on the forecasted path, they were able to saturate her training again, reduce her performance capacity by accumulating more fatigue, reorienting the training to get back onto the performance forecast. And lo and behold, she did win a gold medal at that Olympics. So they actually were able to get her back online. So for me, this is where this is a really important conversation, because periodization is our path, our projection of where we're trying to go. And that's a very difficult thing to do. Programming is how we're going to get there. Monitoring helps us keep on track and keeps us looking at the effectiveness of the training program. Is my
Yeah.
athlete progressing the way I want them to? Are they tolerating the training that I'm giving them? And are they still heading in the direction that we need them to?
Yeah.
So monitoring will inform programming decisions, which are based upon our periodization modeling.
Yeah, it's a really interesting space to operate in because, we know that when we periodize, what we're kind of doing is playing with those dials of, kind of globally, like how do we manage our fatigue and our nutrition and all those kind of things. And then more specifically for our training, it might be, are we training to put on size? Or are we training for metabolic improvements? Are we training for technical improvements? Are we trying to peak for an event or whatever? But one of the things that happens with that is we have a huge amount of literature that tells us what good recommendations are, right? Like they might say like, hey, if you run a 12-week, volume block to improve some conditioning
Yeah.
and build some muscle, and then a 6-week strength block, you might get somebody in the weight room and put them in their 12-week volume block, and then at the end of it, they're still just going up 10 or 20 pounds a workout. And it's like, okay, well, if we can get more out of this, like
Yeah.
why not squeeze this a little bit more? Or my big thing, I found that like I could not sustain peaks for as long as the literature recommended. Like I always ended up on the shorter side of a peaking block because I just would start coming apart at some point. But also had really, really like really positive responses to peaking. So I would get much bigger than predicted increases in, performance. But if I tried to keep going, I would just fall apart. Stuff would be coming off the
Yeah.
bone. So the
Well,
individual athlete sometimes gets lost in the averages for the recommendations.
well, absolutely. And that's why I think, at least in our research team, we tend to report stacked scatter plots.
Hmm.
So we look at the individual trend lines and in addition to the team or group mean lines. So you're going to have a lot of divergence in there. And that's because performance is mitigated by so many factors.
Hmm.
There's some wonderful work by Stoltz Kamani that shows that, for example, if you're under psycho-emotional stress constantly, that your the fatigue response to a training stimulus is magnified. And so you basically then have a longer resistance phase, if you put it in the terms of the general adaptive syndrome, because you have a greater fatigue response and it takes a longer time to dissipate that fatigue. So loads that probably aren't as taxing when you're not under psycho-emotional stress are less, are more physically taxing, and you don't recover as well. So that's the issue that you have to also consider, is that the psychological part, the psycho-emotional stress, and the convergence of nutrition and appropriate sleep can mitigate how you respond to that training stimulus and what you can tolerate. Um, I mean, I've worked with some weightlifters here in Australia as a consultant to their coaches, and their coaches are like, "Oh, we're training 5 days a week." I'm like, "Yeah, but the guy works 70 hours a week. Let's knock it down to 3 and see what happens." And one of the athletes did that, and then he went, wasn't close to national championships, went to the national championship, by training almost half as much,
Yeah.
because it's a global stressor kind of conundrum. And it's not that 3 days a week is the magic answer. It's that 3 days a week was all he could tolerate, knowing that he was working, 60 hours a week and had 2 young children,
Yeah,
like
and sometimes
sub
those
2 years old.
adjustments, like, they almost count double sometimes because not only does he have less training volume, but he also gets that 2 hours twice a week back to his schedule where he can be at home and
Yeah.
relax and do other things that he
Yeah.
needs to do, right? So
Yeah.
sometimes they you almost get to
Yeah.
count them twice when you make those adjustments.
Yeah. Well, it's about balancing, what you can tolerate. Like when you're younger, like if you're just an athlete and you're in your 18 to 20s, 18 to 30s, and you're a full time athlete going to school, it's a lot easier if you're disciplined to control the mitigating factors around training, and
Mhm.
you can handle a lot more training. Now, the average 18 to 23-year-old doesn't always do the smart things, but um, we have to kind of think about that it's why like training centers were such a big deal in the 90s and early 2000s. Is you go to the Olympic Training Center, you could train 3 times a day because someone else does all your cooking, someone does your laundry, someone cleans your room, and your job is basically get up and train.
Yeah.
And that has a whole nother host of issues with psychological issues, but that is one of the reasons why training camps work, is because you mitigate all the external stressors, because stressors are additive. And if we don't have our stressors in alignment outside of training, stress in training gets magnified.
Yeah, pretty, and sometimes pretty dramatically. Like it is,
Oh, absolutely.
you know,
Absolutely.
I think that it's something that a lot of people think that they can mitigate just by like trying to adopt a positive frame of mind or get some caffeine or something, and you can't. It has a really profound impact on your ability to do stuff.
Yes.
Um, so we at this point in the series, we've already talked about doing a needs analysis, and we've talked about testing in other episodes.
Yeah.
So if we have done our needs analysis, one of the things that I am interested in is that in very few of the literature proposals I've read about doing needs analysis, has there been very much conversation about the psychological demands of the sport and then how we might roll that into our periodization. And since you mentioned it earlier, I thought it would be a good
Yeah.
thing to, to just to talk about, because I think it's a space where there might be quite a bit of room for improvement in terms of our end performances.
So when we start to think about psychological goals, we can look at it from a multitude of facets. One, we can talk about resiliency training. How are we going to handle certain stressors and how are we going to deal with those things? In team sports, we want to work on interpersonal communication, interpersonal conflict, and how we work in team dynamics from a psychological perspective. And we can put those kind of skills at different parts of the year. Obviously, they're going to be most important that we are good at it during the season. Well, it's not going to magically appear at the beginning of the season. We have to kind of embed that into our training. We can also look at things like visualization and environmental kind of rehearsal for dealing with the stressors. So it's about building in not only a positive mindset, or mindfulness is also a big thing now, as far as trying to, get in touch with our own mind about how we're doing and where we're going and our goals, and positively reinforcing where we're trying to accomplish. It's also about skills to deal with stress and how are we going to improve our self-efficacy and things like that. And I think different levels of athletes need different things. Young athletes often get in the habit of their performance defines them instead of the process. And we've got to kind of work on that kind of mindset, because performance sometimes just doesn't go well, no matter how well you've trained. But it's about the process of getting better and learning from that process. So we've got to develop that psychological ability. So I look at it from the frame of goal setting. I look at it as a frame of resiliency training, interpersonal communication, and team dynamics. And in an individual sport, you do have some team dynamics. You have it with your coach and your support staff. So those dimensionalities are going to fold into our periodized program as goals for different parts of the annual training plan. So different seasons, if we use that terminology, or I would prefer to use periods of training, will have different psychological targets. Now, in season, we would want to work on things like mental recovery, but mental recovery can't be stop training and go to the beach and drink. It
Mm-hmm.
has to be, how do we deal with disconnecting from the thinking about training while still having training as part of our process.
Yeah. So, I really like that. Resiliency training is a big thing. I've interviewed a handful of coaches when positions have come open and stuff, and almost every coach I ever talk to tells me they're going to make tough kids, and then when you ask them how we do that, it's usually just crickets. And so, I think
Yeah.
like there is research on it. It is worth looking into because I think we have a tendency, at least, maybe it's more like an American football cultural thing, but there's that tendency to be like, just have them run gassers, just hold their breath and run sprints until they feel like they can't do it anymore, and then do it again. And that's not really one is that that's a huge amount of training volume and fatigue and everything else that you have to manage. But two, it's not really the outcome that you want. And so it's definitely worth, if that's something that, you notice in your team or your sport or in yourself, going and looking and seeing what is it that actually looks like. And maybe we'll find a specialist and have them on and talk about it.
Oh, I think there's a lot in that space. I do think doing hard things as a group is important,
Hmm.
but they have to be hard things that are accomplishable.
Yeah.
It can't just be something that pounds people into the ground. It has to be done with purpose. And so this is why when you look at a periodization framework is, when are we going to do hard things? And
Yeah.
the athlete needs to know when it's coming, and then you put in strategies about how are you going to handle doing this hard block of training. Um, we're going to improve our nutritional intake. We're going to make sure we get enough sleep. We're going to, do mindfulness and relaxation techniques and things of that nature. And so we can build that in and we can plan it and say, all right, this is going to be on my annual training plan. All right, this looks like, ooh, this is a stretch in the competitive season where it's going to be a lot of travel. We've got a lot of high stakes games that we know from historical competitive, statistics. So what are we going to put in here to help those athletes manage the stress of actually dealing with that competitive period? So that's what I mean by also with our annual training plan is highlighting the points in the year where certain threats are that I have to be mindful of. Like, for
Mhm.
example, if I'm playing in the SEC in college football, I know that the games are tough and there's going to be a tough stretch somewhere in that season. So how are we going to manage the media scrutiny if we're having issues? How are we going to manage the social media issues? And how are we going to manage the athletes' nutrition and well-being, in addition to preparing them for performance,
Yeah.
which is the ultimate, measure of our success.
Yeah, so when we start our periodization and we're going to zoom out and look at what our needs are, it's not just what are the physical needs of the sport or the physical
Mhm.
capacity of the athletes. It's like, what are all of the other factors? Like, how are we going to deal with finals if we're in a high school or collegiate setting? How are we going to deal with the strains of travel and all those kinds of things?
Oh, absolutely. So my students, as part of their graduate studies, it's one of their culminating projects. They have to do a annual training plan. And what we're doing is, on that annual training plan, most people are like, oh, annual training plan, just outline your calendar of competitions. No, 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 no. That's just the frame that we build from. From that, what we also do is we put in a line in the annual plan called Coach's Priority, and we ask them, okay, which competitions are you do you believe are the ones that we need to be, spot on for? And then coaches will tell you which ones. First thing they're gonna say, I want to win them all, and they're like, well, coach, we can't peak for everything. So what are the ones that are the real historical competitions? Michigan, Ohio State in college football. Yes, it's always going to be a battle. So we know that's going to be really important to the team. But then we also have our peaking index where we're going to try to gauge, okay, how close to a true peak do we want to be? Knowing that we really in a team sport can only go to the true peak around the championship.
Hmm.
And so we're going to outline that. And then from there, we're going to also say, all right, we're going to break it down into certain preparation periods. And where are we going to put our benchmark testing? So benchmark testing is going to be, how are we tracking to our targets? So benchmark testing could be things like vertical jump, mid-thigh pull, some sort of sprint metric or endurance metric, depending on the sport, or reactive strength index type score, something that is a benchmark for your sport. One of the best examples of this was David Hamilton for the 2012 Olympics with the British hockey team. He had a wonderful benchmarking path where he benchmarked them over the years leading into 2012. And he had it, this score on the mid thigh pull per kilogram or Newton's body mass had to be at this level. If you were at this level, you're gold. If you're at this level, you're bronze, silver, whatever. And he was able to track them going into the games. And he showed that they improved over their multi-year plan. And they ended up beating Australia in the Olympics, which was a pretty big deal at the time, considering Australia was one of the number one teams in the world
Hmm.
in women's hockey. So I think that's what we're talking about, is outlining those things as well. Um, and then basically looking at right now, where are my strength training goals, my conditioning goals, um, my flexibility goals, all those things fit in there, and medical screening as well.
Yeah.
When am I going to medical screen people?
Yeah, and it's important to like I know that it's probably pretty intuitive for a lot of people to think like, okay, well, I know that I need to perform well in my sport, so my sport needs to be a bigger part of my training, as I get to where it's time to perform, right? But some of those characteristics we can gain or lose that fitness pretty fast, or it can be pretty persistent, right? And
Yeah.
so when we're looking at a long time out from our season, what are the things that are more persistent? Like what can we do when it's postseason, off season that we can carry through with us? I mean, obviously there's gonna be some variation depending on what sport you're on in and everything,
Yeah.
but what are kind of the physical traits that we want to look at when we're a long ways out?
So if we start with, like, we've just finished an annual training plan, let's say we've just competed in a national championship and we've won. Let's say
Mhm.
we've won. So we'll probably go to a transition, and the length of that transition is going to be mitigated by a couple factors. One, rules. Certain leagues have defined rules. You have to go away for X amount of weeks.
Mhm.
Um, Injury status. How injured is the athlete? Let's be honest. If you're an elite athlete, you're going to carry an injury through the season at some point, and you're probably going to have to deal with that.
Yeah.
Does that injury require surgery, or does it just need regular rest and rehabilitation? So typically, a transition shouldn't be more than about 4 weeks, maybe 2 to 4. The reason you don't want a really long transition is because you're going to then have a long period of detraining,
Mhm.
because let's say that we have a 2 week taper coming into the end of the season. So we see a reduced training volume there. What happens to fitness? It starts to decline. If I then tack on another 4 weeks of detraining in a transition phase, now I've detrained for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
So for me, I envision, and the way I think of a transition between annual training plans is a reverse taper. So I'm going to slowly build up training capacity through the transition. So I may have no training the week after the main competition, but then I'm going to build back some training. Then I'm going to build back some more training, build back some more, and then I'm going to jump into my training.
And those
So
we have a little bit of evidence on that kind of idea, right? Like that those don't always look the same at every level, right? Like if you're very novice or
no,
very experienced, those are going to look different. So, those timelines and recommendations might be a little different, right?
yeah, it
Yeah,
depends. Like, um, the classic answer, strength conditioning, is it
it
depends.
depends.
Everything depends on the type of athlete you're dealing with, the type of sport you're dealing with. Um, I am not a big fan of long transition phases.
Hmm.
I just think what happens then is we lose too much fitness because athletes go off and do dumb things. Um, And, you know, those kind of things can really impact our performance capacity down the line. I mean, you look at some of the great American football players. Tom Brady is the one that comes to mind to me. He didn't take very long periods of time off after winning Super Bowls. He went back into training, and obviously, you know, greatest quarterback to ever, you know, live. And so I think we have to kind of think about that. Now, one of the things that you have to realize is, yes, we have to take time for mental recovery
Hmm.
and you know, and decompressing, but that doesn't mean detraining. And the reason I say that is because if you want to see an athlete have mental issues, watch them if they haven't done much training and they try to get into training block and they haven't trained. Their frustration level will be at another level because they are used to doing things and they can't do it because they're not fit enough to do it.
Oh yeah.
So I think we have to manage that as well. Now, so each period has a certain kind of goal, and so there's going to be a part of the year where I have to build foundation. You know, I've got to build that foundation that sets the stage. Now, American football is like probably my favorite sport to work with because you know when the season is, you have long off season to build, you know, lots of muscle mass and lots of strength. Um, and you can set up blocks of time or periods where you're going to focus on those key factors. During that time, you know, in talking to Boyd Epley of the old Nebraska days, they actually did very little technical and running work, mostly just get big and strong
Yeah.
when Nebraska was at the top. Now, that gets us into this idea that when we're looking at a team sport, we've got different things going on at different levels. You know, NCAA rules, who knows what they're going to be in the future, but let's use the classic rules. In the off season was only 8 hours of training.
Yeah.
So you have to manage that. So that 8 hours, you know, I'm going to invest in strength training, and putting mass on in strength and minimal technical tactical work or skills work. And then you kind of shift that as you get to in season. It becomes primarily the sport that you're doing and the maintenance loading of the strength training. Now, maintenance loading is a discussion, you know, for another day, I guess, because there's a million different ways that we can attack that problem.
Uh-huh.
Um, but fundamentally, we're basically targeting certain things, and I really believe in a strength training based model. You know, the sequential development of characteristics is really quite important. You've got to build muscle mass before you can build strength, before you can express speed strength or strength speed. And Jonathan Folan's group out of Loughborough University just published a really amazing paper that I believe will be a seminal paper that clearly shows that you have to build on hypertrophy to maximize strength in the long run, not in the short run. The short run, it's all neural, but over time, and the more trained you get, the more muscle mass you have to kind of develop.
Yeah,
Now that
I
good.
was I was just gonna say it's a really interesting phenomenon because, like I have mostly worked with high school kids in the past. I'm not really coaching very much anymore, but um, like I've worked with baseball players and swimmers and all kinds who they don't want to get bigger. And I'm like, that Sammy Sosa and Barry Bonds and all those guys are, like they're they're skirting the rules to get as big as they can. Like it's an asset, like to have more muscle, you know.
It doesn't mean you're like you can, like, for example, if you're in a weight class sport, you can get more muscular and get
Hmm.
leaner and
Yeah.
stay in that class. Now, at some point, you're going to have to, you know, change. You know, the classic way to look at it for me is in the sport of weightlifting. You know, eventually you move up weight classes. You're not going to stay in the same weight class that you started out in because eventually you're going to gain mass. Um, you know, so we've got to think about the asset of strength. Strength and muscle mass obviously is important for health and wellness, but it's also important for performance. But it has to be functional mass.
Hmm.
It's not just mass for mass sake. You know, if I'm a sprinter, while I do need some upper body strength and size, I don't need, you know, arms as big as my legs.
Yeah, you don't need a
Um,
500-pound bench press to run a 9 second, 100. That's not
no,
a
but you
yeah.
probably need a 500-pound back squat.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
um, so I think you have to kind of look at that as well. It's functional hypertrophy is what we have to kind of frame it as. I think.
Yeah. Which is a hard it's this is another space where like the language really lets us down because when you say the word functional in this space, like it's rife with people who have the most bizarre ideas about same thing. The other word that gets it is dynamic. So there's dynamic has some applications. It's a meaningful word in the sports space, but when you hear somebody say like my programs are dynamic and my outcomes are functional, then it might not mean anything.
The term functional training is bonkers to me, because all training is functional depending on how you
Right.
design it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, well, I think, to be honest, in the profession of strength and conditioning and sports science, it's one of the biggest problems that we have is nomenclature,
Yeah.
as far as how we define things. Um, periodization to me is very different to someone who thinks periodization is a block of tens, a block of fives, a block of threes.
Right.
That's not periodization. That's programming. And those are strategies. Periodization to me is, how are we structuring our end game?
Hmm.
Or how are we getting to the end game? Now, a tactic I could use is to sequentially train hypertrophy, tens, fives, threes. But we also have to think about the dynamics of exercise selection in that model as well.
Yeah.
Not to devalue that variability in training. We've got to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting thing because there is kind of an up and a downstream correlation with those things, right? So, like, if you're only doing sets of three, like, how productive is your hypertrophy work really going to be? It can be super productive if you are, planning all of the rest of every other training variable around doing those sets of three, but it's going to be hard, right? So, like, that, I think that's part of why people fall into that kind of cognitive trap of thinking that that model of the tens, five, threes, or whatever is the periodization, because there are kind of best practices for whatever lane you want to be in, and they match up with those steps, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it depends on the sport, it depends on the outcome, it depends on the training ability, but also it feeds into, something you talked about at the beginning, was this term linear periodization, which, to be honest, is a false narrative. There's no
Yeah.
such thing as linear periodization. If you read Matt Viev's book, he actually talks about the fact that one of the goals of periodization is the removal of linearity. And so to have the term linear periodization is oxymoronic.
Yeah.
And Vladimir Issarin actually in his 2010 paper, talked about this, saying that there are wave fluctuations in traditional periodization.
Hmm.
It's not linear. Mike Stone talked about it extensively, back in the 1990s. And he's given, like, the false narrative that he has promoted linear periodization has been on the books for at least 2 decades now. And I studied with Mike. I was there when he was writing these things, and he was clearly saying it's not linear.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
which is
it's
another nomenclature gap, right? Because
Yeah,
when I say linear periodization, I know that I'm not looking for all of my training variables to improve in a sequential manner from the beginning, or from a postseason to competition season. Like, that's
yeah,
not what I want to do when I say linear periodization.
yeah.
But there's not other language that we use for it, and so it is really interesting how those overlap.
I think, well, yeah, and then daily undulate. Well, I'm sorry, everything undulates on a daily basis depending on the intensity volume relationship.
Hmm.
Um, and we should have light heavy days. If you have light heavy days, or light heavy training sessions, you can tolerate a lot more training load than you can if every day is the same. And so the nomenclature really has to take a shift. And I talk about it in three ways. One, parallel periodization. Basically, we train everything simultaneously. Think of it as the early stages of a long-term athlete development plan. When an athlete needs to have multilateral training, it has to all be kind of balanced, and it gives them a really good fitness base.
And
At
you get
some
into, you talked about doses earlier, right? And when
Yeah.
you're in that parallel, you're probably at a point of athlete fitness where you can improve their VO2 max and their glycolytic
Mhm.
cycle and their maximal strength and their size and their sport
Yeah,
performance all at the same time, because the dose to adjust those fitness styles is really low because they don't have that training experience, right?
exactly. And we call those the newbie gains.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Everything goes great in the first few years. But so parallel models work really well at the early stages of long-term athlete development. But the problem, as you're highlighting, is to get more adaptation, we got to increase the dose. So what do we do? Well, we can spread that training out and separate it so it's on different days and things like that, and try to saturate the week or block of training with more training. But eventually we get to our load tolerance level where we just can't recover, because we can't add any more training, because they just can't recover from it, or there's just not enough time in the day,
Hmm.
because I have to do other things. So then we have to start to think about, okay, what are some other strategies that we can use? And this is where, you know, sequential periodization, or what would be better, most people refer to as block periodization. Block periodization is just a form of sequential training.
Hmm.
We would then start to look at, all right, saturating on one dose one targeted outcome and sequence. Okay. And so that gives us the ability to saturate the system more with that specific activity.
Yeah.
So
And that can get
basically
super
more training.
granular, right? Like I've talked to several like pretty successful bodybuilders who will do that just within the space of hypertrophy. Like they'll put their training volume on maintenance for their quads so that they can do more training volume on their hamstrings kind of thing. So
Yep.
like, how you move those dials can get really granular.
Well, and that's where we would move into what's called emphasis periodization. So
Hmm.
emphasis periodization is something that I started to work on as I transitioned into the tactical environment, which really challenged my thinking about training. Because you have individuals that need to be balanced or good at everything, but they are very highly trained. So we can't really use a parallel model because they can't tolerate it. So
Hmm.
what we look at now is an emphasis model, and it's an extension of Charlie Francis's vertical integration model, which is a form of emphasis training, where we basically have the defined characteristics that we're trying to build, and then we're putting an emphasis on those characteristics. So, for example, if I need to maximize strength, well, I will reduce the amount of aerobic training, but I'll still do so
Hmm.
for a tactical athlete. And so I can adjust those dials depending on what I'm trying to maximize or maintain. So some things will be maximized, some things will be maintained, and some things we're going to let detrain a little bit, but not completely detrain. So we're going to still touch it. Duncan French and I, prior to COVID, worked on this a little bit for UFC fighters because they have that similar problem of not knowing when they're going to compete sometimes. So they have to kind of be in this state of readiness that is easily manipulable.
Hmm.
So for me, periodization, all periodization models that you read about in the literature fall into one of three categories: parallel, sequential, or emphasis models. Now, what's really interesting about this kind of taxonomy is that if you look at John Hawley's work on cell signaling responses to concurrent training, you look at very novice trained athletes seem to get better in concurrent training,
Well, okay, so
which,
let's just real quick for anybody who's new to the space because it is a fundamentals thing. Let's talk real
yeah,
quick about what concurrent training is, and then go back and talk about like signaling is the things that happen inside our body in response to exercise.
yeah,
They're special to whatever type of work we're doing. But
yeah.
what does it mean when we say concurrent training? Like, what are we talking about?
We're basically training two training factors that are antagonistic to each other. So, for example, a lot of long distance running makes you not very strong.
Mhm.
And a lot of strength training, even though it is counterproductive per se, cell signaling wise to running, can actually enhance running economy.
Right.
So they conflict with each other. It's a recovery problem, really, if you think about it.
Yeah.
Um, it's truly a recovery problem. So we've got these two training factors. Let's say aerobic distance running and strength training, and you can't maximize strength and do a lot of aerobic training. Um, and you can get some benefit for strength training, aerobic training, but typically we call it the interference effect.
Hmm.
Now, in this was been shown for a very 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 long time that this is a thing. Recently people are questioning it, but when you dig into their papers, they're looking at very novice untrained people, and what we know is with novice untrained people, they have a lot of recoverability, because they're not really training that hard. I mean, they're
Yeah, they're
training hard
not
for
good at
them, but
working, right?
yeah, they're not working really really as hard as they think they are. But the adaptations, we see we can get both. But as they become more trained, that interference effect starts to show up more and more. So if we think about it in the lens of periodization, we know novices should do multilateral training. Well, yeah, they'll get better at everything. As they become a little bit more developed, we're going to probably shift to some sort of emphasis model where we can do everything at little different characteristics. And then when we really want to maximize some attribute, we have to go more sequential.
Hmm.
And it aligns wonderfully with John Hawley's cell signaling literature. I was in Spain to debate Dr. Jeremy Lanicky on periodization, who he was saying that periodization is useless and we shouldn't do it anymore. And I was there to debate him, and I happened to be there with John Hawley, and we had breakfast and we discussed this, and he was in agreement with me that that does make sense. Um, One of the things I would highlight is that that means that periodization models are not static. You don't just choose one. You can use multiple types at different times of the year. For example, I might use a traditional sequential model in the off season in American football because
Hmm.
I want to develop a lot of muscle mass and I want to develop a lot of strength. In season, I may be on the emphasis model
Yeah.
where I'm trying to maintain different attributes of physical fitness.
Yeah, one of
So,
the nice things about thinking about it in that emphasis model is that the minimum volumes to sustain fitness are actually pretty low in a lot of cases. So like
yes,
unless you're trying to get to the point where you're trying to get everything you can out of a peak, a lot of times it's actually pretty easy to sustain, a VO2 max and a strength standard and stuff just with really minimal levels of training.
yeah. And if we saturate, like, so we go to the American Football Ball. So
Mhm.
the weekend is the game. So, like, it's a Saturday game most of the time. And so that means, we typically will probably train pretty hard on Monday and Tuesday, or at least Tuesday and Wednesday. And
Mhm.
we saturate the system with training load again, and then we pull back again. And almost like each microcycle or week of training has its own mini kind of unloading going into the competition. And the degree of unloading is dependent on how much travel we do, the game, how tough it's going to be, how we project it. And we can see that basically we're looking for opportunities in season to add load and then recover from it.
Mhm. So you could set like in that model, right? You can set yourself a minimum threshold. You're like, this is the amount of work we have to do to maintain our fitness. And then
Yep.
when we don't have to travel and we don't have finals and we don't have whatever those other stresses are, then we can dial up and throw in a little extra volume in as long as it's not going to
Yeah.
compete with our competition day.
Yeah. If we have a bye week, we can
Mhm.
basically say, all right, the early part of the bye, so basically 2 weeks between games. So after this hard game, we could have a little bit of recovery, then resaturate the system towards the end of that week, and then come back down the next week
Mhm.
to normal training. Almost use a intentional overreaching on a micro scale.
Yeah. And so and that's the sport like we talked about value judgments again before like how you progress in your season there matters a bunch, but there might be something like if you're in a track and field season and you just have to end the season, in the top 24 or whatever to make it to the national meet, then you might not even need to worry about, how productive your a lot of your meets are leading up to that. Like it's nice to score points and it feels good to perform well and everything, but if you are really driving your fitness, you might be able to just kind of train through some of those early season meets
Yes.
and focus on the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's the thing is we've got to get in a mindset that we've got to do well when it counts, not well all the time. Now, team
Hmm.
sports are different because we've got to do well all the time. I mean, if you're in American football, literally to make the national championship, you got to win every game.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. The way it's set up. So you've got to have a big roster if you want to get people on different fitness characteristics. But in most sports that are non-team sports, you just have to qualify and you can build through the qualifying rounds. Now, if you're the best in the world, you should qualify. If you're not qualifying, there's something not right. When Usain Bolt was at his peak, I'm pretty sure he trained through a lot of the early sprinting events to
Hmm.
lead into when he's going to try to perform at his peak. What monkeys things up a little bit now is the financial part of it, where if I win the Diamond League, let's say in athletics, I
Hmm.
make X amount of money. And so that changes the dynamics. So that's when we need to have different programming strategies where we have saturation, recovery, almost like in this block model kind of construct with tighter blocks, realizing that the shorter the overreaching, the lower the super compensation when we go through the taper of realization.
Yeah. Okay, so now we've managed to make it 50 minutes into this thing and I didn't even get like the basic vocabulary, but can we rewind a little bit? Because you
Yeah.
dropped microcycle in there along with a gem that was really brilliant that I'll circle back to before we get done, hopefully. But can we talk a little bit about the language that we use when we talk about our
Yeah.
periodization planning?
I think it's important to do. And it gets a little murky because there's really two schools of thought in periodization. They come from either the Russian lineage or the Soviet lineage or the German lineage. And so I tend to be more in line with the Soviet taxonomy. So
Hmm.
periodization is the big topic, and then underneath periodization is a multi-year training plan. So multi-year plan, think of it as in the best example is a quadrennial, which is 4 annual training plans
Uh-huh.
or 4 years of training. Um, Historically, that fit really nice with high school sports
Yep.
because you have a 4 year academic calendar, and what you're doing with your freshmen is very different than what you're doing with your seniors. and you can align your periodization goals with the level of development. It works really well in the Olympic cycle because it's 4 years between Olympics. It used to work really well in college sports. With NIL, I'm not so sure it will
Yeah,
because
because
athletes are changing teams.
changing divisions and everything, right? So yeah.
Oh, yes. It's actually something that myself and several other strength conditioning people have talked about is NIL is going to be a disaster for, I think, injuries in the future. Because if they're changing teams every year, they're changing strength and conditioning philosophies every year. And you're never getting a saturated training base built over time
Yeah.
because performance is going to outweigh development. And
It's
that's going to be a big issue.
Yeah, we had Ron McKeefery on, who's coached at Alabama and UW and coach of the year a couple times. He's written a couple really good books about coaching and
Mm-hmm. I know
um,
Ron well.
yeah, and he was talking about how as a strength coach, you're the head coach 75% of the year. And I'm one of the things that I'm hopeful out of this is that programs will realize how important that position is and invest more in it because one of the only ways that we're going to mitigate that is by having high quality professionals and all of the, everywhere that they could go.
Well, yeah, but I still think you still have the philosophical, there are very different
Uh-huh.
philosophies of strength training. Like, for example, Jimmy Radcliffe is in my mind one of the best in the business, and his philosophy is very different than, let's say, the fella that it was at Miami that just left. They're very different in their training development.
Hmm.
So I think that's going to be a challenge. But so regardless of the NIL, we basically have our multi-year plans, which typically four. Um, Aligns nicely with long-term athlete development planning because you have multiple year training plans in long-term athlete development and stages of performance benchmarking across those multi-year plans. Then you have the annual training plan. And the annual training plan is basically your annual calendar. And it doesn't have to fit the calendar year. It could align with the university calendar or the academic calendar. And what that is going to be grounded on is your competitive schedule.
Hmm.
And so your competitive schedule is the anchor to your annual training plan. So everything's built off of where the competitive schedule is. And then you're going to break that down into periods, preparation and competition and transition. Now, that terminology is very common in periodization thinking.
Yeah.
However, coaches think in the terms of seasons.
Yeah.
So off season is preparation, preseason is pre-competition, competition is competition.
Yeah. And the
Uh,
other
uh,
term we often hear for these like bigger chunks is like macro cycles. Yeah. Or
so
is,
macro cycles are going to contain, and that's it's if you have only one competitive season, you have one macro cycle in a year.
mhm.
But let's say you have a high school athlete who does football in the fall and does basketball in the winter and athletics in the spring. They would actually have three macro cycles. The
Mhm.
macro cycle is a composite of preparation, competition, and transition.
All right.
So that's where we would get the macro cycle term.
Okay.
So annual training plans can have one to multiple macro cycles. Underneath the macro cycle is the mesocycle, which is often called a block of training. It's 2 to 6 weeks in duration, or 2 to 6 microcycles in general. Now, a microcycle is a week, but it could
Well,
be at
yeah, I was
kind
gonna
of.
say plus or minus, right? Unless you're like a big fan of asynchronous programming or something.
So a microcycle is most commonly programmed as 7 days because it's
Mhm.
just easy to manage.
Yeah.
But it could be as little as 2 to roughly uh, probably two to 14 days,
Yeah.
depending on the language that you use.
Yeah.
A sport like basketball, like let's use college basketball, where you could have multiple, or even women's volleyball, really, if you look at Nebraska's women's volleyball team, which is quite phenomenal. Um, they have multiple competitions a week. So you could basically break a week of training into multiple microcycles
Hmm.
if you wanted to. I
Yeah.
think
And
for
then
simplicity, say 7 is probably smarter.
yeah, and a lot of times they'll even you'll see people who will put like 2 or 3 games together as a microcycle, right? Where it'll be 6 or 8 or 10 days or something. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. But fundamentally, if you think about it as 7 for a microcycle, 2 to 6 weeks for a mesocycle, you're doing all right.
Hmm.
Macrocycle, Bompa, when I helped him write his book over, he had time frames to the macrocycle. And the problem with that is it's always driven by the season.
Yeah.
And the season length is dependent. You look at the NFL as the season's just getting longer and longer and longer. You look at the Premier League of Soccer, you pretty much have no time off. And so I think you have to kind of frame it in that fashion. Now, after the microcycle, you have your training days and your training sessions. So how many sessions per day? Now, when we start to think about periods of training, we can actually have general prep and specific prep. And they can be trained in isolation in the classic way where I do very, low technical, high volume kind of work in the general prep, get more sport specific in the specific prep, and so on. Or you can use the Bondarchuk mentality of training them simultaneously
Hmm.
under preparation.
Yeah. So the the macro cycle is going to be determined by our season, number of seasons, our calendar year. Like it's looking
Yep.
at the big overarching group, right?
Yep.
The micro cycles are however we plan our training. Like I'm a big fan of asynchronous training. I plan all my training in 5-day rounds for the last few years,
Yep.
but most people do it in a week. And it makes a ton of sense to do that because it's a super convenient way for us to put all of our training volume into a period of time, think about the fatigue, all that kind of stuff. Why is it that our mesocycles land on the 2 to 6 week, range? What should we be thinking about when we're thinking about that period of training?
So for me, the way I look at the mesocycle is it's a block of training that has a focus. So I could have a 2 to 6 week hypertrophy focused training block. So across that block, my decisions are about maximizing something.
Mm-hmm.
And so a block is a target that aligns with our annual training plan goals. So if I look at that 2 to 6 weeks, and I hate to use the wording it depends, but it really depends.
I
The
know.
most common length is 4 weeks
Uh-huh.
because we see asymptotic responses after about 4 weeks if we don't change training dramatically. Now, with 2 to 6, it depends on how you're looking at it. For example, in an emphasis model, Zatsiorsky suggests that you should only have 2 week mesocycles, and every third week, you basically rotate the focus.
Mm-hmm.
So you're never really getting a lot of detraining. Now, it depends on how we're linking those blocks together. So, for example, a realization or tapering block may be only 2 weeks because
Yeah.
a 2 week taper is very common. The length could be as long as 6 weeks, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. So, for example, let's say I did an overreaching block of about, I don't know, let's say 4 weeks. I would probably need a reduced training load for transmutation of about 6 weeks or 5 weeks to deal with the residual fatigue from the overreaching, and then a 2 week realization.
Yeah.
It depends on how much load we put before each block or after each block. So think of it as changing gears or changing focus when we change blocks.
And then the other like really important piece that goes into the mesocycles there is the kind of those issues of like systemic fatigue, right? Because when we make our microcycles, you can squat and then you can come back and squat again and it's going to be good and productive, right? But we can only stack up so many of those before we run out. And so I just like that's just something I've always been really curious by how, fatigue acclimates and how our mesocycles are put together.
So I think you have to. So for me, I think you have to drill down to the microcycle because really the microcycle is how we're implementing the goals of the mesocycle.
Mm-hmm.
So typically, there's a couple ways to structure a 4 week mesocycle. You could do what's called a 3 up, 1 down mesocycle, where you're basically increasing workload over the 3 weeks. And in about 3 weeks, you start to have systemic fatigue and you need recovery. So you drop down on the 4th week.
Throw a
And
deload in
typically
there.
for a deload. And usually the deload week is where you feel the worst. The light loads feel heavier than the heavy loads. Or one that we use a lot in weightlifting is 2 up, 1 down, 1 up. So you go up 2, recover a little bit, and then go really hard on the 4th week.
And then that's where it probably becomes really valuable to think about what that training stimulus is going to be of each one of those
Yep.
mesocycles, right? Because if you lead that into repeating that mesocycle and you're doing 2 up and 1 down again, you're really just doing the the 3 on 1 off thing, right? So you got to think about what the variable is that you want to adjust.
Yep, yep,
Yeah.
yep. And how the exercise is sequenced between mesocycles. For example, one that I always use as an example with my students. So in a hypertrophy block, I may do, behind the neck press.
Hmm.
In the strength block, I may be doing a push press. In a strength speed block, I may be doing a push jerk.
Hmm.
So the exercises are working the same muscle groups, just in different ways. Um, and you're basically aligning with the targets of the mesocycle. Now, one thing that I think people really, really need to think about is how you program the loads within the training week. And the reason I suggest that is, let's say that I kept the loading pretty flat across the week.
Yeah.
What you'll see is a high monotony and strain. And the higher the monotony and strain, the more risk of injury. You can get the same strain and less monotony by having heavy days and light days. And so you're varying the workload and stimulus between days. Well, what is that doing? You're reducing the workload after being fatigued. And then what that does is it makes it so that you are not being put into a more injurious kind of potential.
Hmm.
Mike Stone classic 1980s kind of training was squat, let's say, 80 to 85% on Monday, drop down to 70 to 75 on Thursday.
Hmm.
And what is that doing? That's accounting for the cumulative fatigue. And to be honest, we've done some really interesting research in our lab, and we found that the 1RM back squat is pretty much within 5% if you test it Monday, Wednesday, Friday. That's pretty good. That's
Yeah.
tight.
Yeah.
We did the same with the deadlift with the 3RM. It was pretty much the same. So if you unload by 10% towards the back end of the week, if you're repeating an exercise, you're accounting for your residual fatigue.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
the nice thing about high low, having the high low days is also you're going to experience very different things in terms of your performance in your sport during that time, right?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things we always did when we worked with sprinters is we offset load. So the beginning of the week is the higher load strength training, the end of the week is the higher load running volume.
Hmm.
So you're offsetting. So I think that's part of the programming process. So for me, periodization encompasses the multi-year training plan, the annual training plan, the macro cycle. The programming part of the equation starts coming in at the meso and micro cycle.
Yeah. Yeah, where you start making your decisions about how you're going to manage your loads, how you're going to manage your fatigue.
Yep. And the planning part is what links the two. And that's where you choose, do I use an emphasis, sequential, or parallel model of training to target those periodization goals?
Yeah. Yeah. So, we've already gone over an hour, but let's I do want to see if we can't touch base on some of the low-hanging fruit or some of the mistakes that are commonly made, just so that we have an idea of what we shouldn't be doing when we're thinking about periodization.
Um, I think one of the things that I think about with periodization that is somewhat problematic at times is that I think young coaches are a little bit overreactive to changing programming. Someone can have a bad day in the gym.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean the program needs to be blown up and rewritten. It's when things start to creep in over time. So I think not engaging in an effective monitoring program that looks at internal and external loads and is informative. Somebody could have a bad day. It might not be your program that's the problem. It could be they just got divorced.
Uh-huh.
You know, they haven't told you that. Or so conversations and communicating with your athletes is important. I also think that people get a little bit rigid with structure sometimes, dogmatic with systems. Um, I think you have to figure out what works for your athlete.
Hmm.
Some athletes need more exposures to higher intensities, some don't. And those are programming decisions. And I think we have to kind of manipulate the programming in a way that actually aligns with our athletes' ability to recover. Now, when I'm working with periodization, as I've gotten older and a little bit wiser, maybe I'm starting to believe that periodization of nutrition may be as important, if not more important, than the periodization of programming. And there's been some wonderful work that's just been published out of the English Institute of Sport that they actually give an example of periodized nutrition and how to choose nutritional interventions around your training and in responsiveness to the type of training you're doing.
That's
And I
gonna be
think
a whole
it
nother.
is amazing. With my next book edition of my book, we will have a much more developed nutrition section, because I do believe that, for example, on a non-training day, we can reduce carbohydrate intake. We don't
Mhm.
need as much carbohydrate. We will keep protein relatively stable. So integrating that into training, I think, is so critical, because what good nutrition does, it helps you tolerate more training load. The other thing that I think is important is understanding recovery dynamics, and that recovery interventions are essential, with the idea that sleep is the cornerstone, as is nutrition. If nutrition and sleep aren't right, it doesn't matter how many cold water plunges you take, you're not going to get the recovery interventions you want. And when I start to look at those other interventions like cold water, hot water, and there's a lot of debate in that space, and things like peristaltic pressure, like Normatec, and things like that, you also have to think about the fact that you have to periodize those as well. So, for example, in season, our whole goal is rapid recovery.
Mhm.
It's got to be, because we're trying to get back to get to train to get to competition. Adaptation is not our main focus in season. It's not. It's more about not losing adaptation. Off season is more about stimulating adaptation. So it's probably illogical to do lots of cold water immersion in the off season where adaptation is our main goal.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean we wouldn't do it at all. If it's an overreaching week, we might do it to tolerate overreaching.
Right.
In season, post match, cold water immersion does not seem like a bad option, because what we're trying to do is deal with rapid recovery.
Yeah, I mean the cold water immersions. What's the line I heard? A non-negotiable norepinephrine stimulator, right? So like you're gonna feel fresh when you get done.
Yeah. And so we can look at where we're going to put things. So, like, for example, if I'm doing travel and I notice on my annual training plan, I'm going to do a lot of flying, well, compression garments can become important.
Hmm.
Or, there's some really great research overreaching. If I sleep with compression pants on overnight, I will speed recovery.
Hmm.
So it's about having strategies in place. So I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is thinking periodization is just resistance training.
So can we dial back just a second? So you mentioned that sleeping in compression socks improves recovery. Should we talk just real quick about like when we say that? Oftentimes, people in the sport think that recovery means that they've done all the adapting from their exercise that they're going to do, and they're at 100%. So just real quick, let's talk about what the difference is between the recovery and the actual adaptations that we're looking for out of training.
So adaptation takes time. It's not instantaneous. I wish it was. I wish I could go in the weight room and squat and immediately be stronger. Um, it takes time. Your body has to go through processes, and it's cell signaling processes to adapt and adapt its physiology. When we're talking about recovery, we're talking about sensations of feelings of freshness. We're talking about movement compliance and really just returning to performance capacity.
Mhm.
And so that we can train. So there's a really good argument for recovery strategies that Bill Sands makes, that if we implement recovery strategies more, we can tolerate higher loads and higher training volumes. And that stimulates more adaptation in the long run. So we're using recovery to make it facilitate our ability to train.
But
And
it's
I think that
also
makes
like,
a lot of sense.
yeah, and it's important that we don't get to the point where we're using those recovery strategies to like mask, persistent soreness and injuries and stuff, right? Because that's another thing that we'll often see. Good athletes love work. Like they like to suffer, they like to be in the process, and so sometimes they'll use those to get through when they shouldn't be doing that, right?
Well, and also I think I hear this a lot from young students nowadays. They want to spend more time in recovery because recovery activities feel good.
Yeah.
And they think they have to be completely recovered to train, which you do not. You
Hmm.
do not need to be completely recovered. And in fact, you probably should never be completely recovered when you're training, because your athlete needs to train, in my mind, in the dull haze of fatigue. There's always got to be some level of fatigue. Complete recovery is basically detrained.
Yeah.
Um, and
Did you we had Cody on?
Cody
Um
was one of my athletes, actually,
yeah. We had Cody on. He was talking about when he was one of your athletes, how he would do your workouts and then do second workouts.
because he would listen.
Yeah. But somebody living in the haze of fatigue. It just reminded me of that. I'm sorry to derail the conversation,
Yeah,
but
no, yeah, no. Cody was one of those gifted athletes that often didn't do what he was supposed to do. He used to drive my wife nuts because she would be like, she knew what he was doing, but there's like, fine, you want to beat yourself into oblivion? Let's see how long you last. Um,
yeah.
but I think one of the things you have to realize is that you have to always have some fatigue level, and you're always training at some level. And more isn't always better. There's a time for more,
Hmm.
and there's a time not for more. And I think you can push yourself too much and break yourself. And that's a rarity, I think, nowadays. I see a lot of young athletes that just don't want to train.
Hmm.
They just want to compete. And so for me, I look at training as you got to earn the right to compete. And so what does periodization do for me? It's the roadmap to earning the right to compete. And
It's the
and I think
payment.
that's how I look at it.
Yeah, I think that one of the big hurdles, like about being successful in sport, is that people fall in love with their sport. They don't necessarily fall in love with training, right? And
Yeah.
so you fall in love with tennis. That doesn't mean you want to be in the weight room three or four times a week or whatever,
Yeah,
But it is a really important part of getting better.
absolutely. And I think that's something you have to kind of consider. I know I had dinner with Michael Johnson in China, and we talked about his competitive career as a sprinter, and he was telling me I didn't like strength training, but I knew if I didn't squat, I wouldn't be fast.
Uh huh.
And so you do what you need to do to be successful. And I think, but what the periodization does is give me the ability to dose the athlete in a way that helps them get where they wanted to be. And my programming is the strategies. And the way I teach it to my students is like, I know I got to build leg strength, right?
Hmm.
I think almost every sport, leg strength has to be built.
Yeah. The
So
end.
if my rugby player gets a back injury and I need to maintain leg strength, I'm kind of up the creek without a paddle as far as squatting goes. So then I can do, belt squats, or I could do hex bar deadlifts, or some other squatting pattern. I'm still accomplishing the goal of the periodized program. I'm building leg strength. I'm just using a different mode or modality to do that.
Yeah, and you can adjust for that later. Like you can train up that axial loading as they recover from the
Yeah,
from the injury, right? So like you
yeah,
just have to be cognizant, right? Because you don't want to put a brand new engine in a car with no tires, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also understanding that you're training. You're not training exercises when you're training athletes for sport. You're training outcomes,
Hmm.
physiological adaptations. So yeah, I love the squat. I think it's one of the most important exercises for an athlete to train. But there are going to be situations where I might not be able to do that, and I've got to have a plan for that
Hmm.
and a strategy to ensure that I develop leg strength that is useful for that athlete. Always knowing that I have to get them back to squatting if I can.
Right. Right. Okay, so we start with before we even get into periodization, we start like by looking at like a needs analysis, right? Like what do I need from my sport? What do I need from the athletes that I got, right?
Yep.
And then we take those needs and we divvy up well, I mean, assuming that we've got athletes who aren't brand new to sport and can do everything all at once and they're amazing and wonderful and we wish we could have them forever. um, we take those needs and we break them up so we focus on the general qualities and we move towards our sport, right?
We in a classic model of periodization, we would, yes.
Yeah.
It depends really on the athlete's level, what kind of competition schedule they have, but yes, that's
Hmm.
the basic framework. I would put a caveat into the needs analysis. In the needs analysis, we also need to think about benchmarking levels of performance capacities in
Hmm.
different metrics. So, for example, I have a basketball player. What is a good vertical jump for a basketball level at each stage of their development?
Hmm.
Okay. And there's a lot of great work being done by Dr. Nick Ripley and Dr. Paul Comfort out of Salford University looking at benchmarking
Hmm.
and looking at characteristics. And so I need to understand those because that's going to help me with my forecasting. Track and field's a really great sport. They have their tables of performance that you can look at and say, oh, yes, a 19-year-old should sprint this time if
Uh-huh.
they want to be really good. So that helps me forecast, where is my athlete now in my benchmark testing? Where am I trying to get to reasonably this year? You
Hmm.
know, there's a young lady on Instagram that's quite entertaining. She's trying to train for the Olympics, and she's not an athlete, and she thinks that she's going to do it in 4 years. And I'm like, good luck with that. Um,
She might
and
be a monster. You never know.
I watched the training videos, and
She's
no,
not a monster.
um, no, no, no. She, bless her heart, she's giving it a go, and
Hmm.
I commend that. But the reality is, we got to look at the performance benchmark characteristics.
Hmm.
We know that long-term athlete development, truly great, and I'll use weightlifting as an example. It takes about 10 years to get pretty good
Yeah.
in most instances. Every once in a while, a Terranaut drops out of the skies and does it in 4.
Hmm.
Um, but generally, it's 10. To quote my good friend, who's the women's coach for the Chinese national team, you're not a real weightlifter until you've been training for 6 years.
Hmm.
Um, and I think you have to kind of look at the time constraints of where the performance benchmarks are over time. And that's part of that needs analysis, because it'll help us forecast our multi-year plans.
Yeah. Yeah. In addition to the psychology and in addition to,
Oh,
managing
absolutely.
the year's demands cognitively and all those other
Yep,
things, right? Yep.
absolutely. Well,
And
because when we
go ahead.
look at the each year, we have to also look at, when I'm planning next year's annual training plan, I have to look retrospectively at what worked, what didn't work, what did the athlete like, what did the athlete not like, um, what strategies did we perform that just needs a little bit of modification in competition. All that informs your next year's annual plan.
Hmm. Yep. And then, needs analysis. We think about benchmarking. We think about where our athletes are at. We make a plan where we are trying to develop the physical characteristics and then move towards a sport, kind of the traditional model. Not that there's not other ways to do it. And then, along the way, we should be monitoring so that we aren't like, spending too much time on something, not spending enough time on something, and trying not to be overly reactive while we're doing it, right?
Yeah, we have to look at a bandwidth, and I think we have to kind of monitor. The way I look at it is monitor the athlete for how they're responding, to determine how much more I can give them.
Hmm.
I don't like to monitor for reduction. I like to monitor for addition.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, there is a step in between, I think, that we need to kind of highlight. Between the needs analysis and actually the planning process is engagement with the coaching staff,
Yep.
the technical, tactical coaching staff, because we've got to get a sense of what they're doing in their side of the equation. Um, and the really people that are really, really, really good at this are able to marry the stuff that we do as strength coaches with the stuff they do as technical coaches.
Hmm.
We shouldn't be doing technical things. We should be doing strength training and conditioning, unless we're in a high school situation where we're both. To be honest, that's the best situation, because I control everything. Um, but we've got to have that conversation, because engaging with a coach, we have to get their perspective of what's important and when they want things to be important and what they perceive. And that dialogue of getting an understanding of the stress that their training is going to have is quite important. We've got to kind of have some sort of way to quantify training stress. And right now, most people use session RPE, which is rating of perceived exertion on a scale of 0 to 10,
Hmm.
multiplied by the time of the session. And if we, in that, the reason we like that is it's universal and we can use it for any training factor. The weakness of it is that people's perception of fatigue is mitigated by personality traits.
Yeah.
Um, I
Highly
call it the
variable.
highly variable. I call it the rock marshmallow principle.
Uh-huh.
You have the rocks that will pound themselves into the ground, and you
Yep.
have the marshmallows who don't want to do anything,
Yep.
um, because they're smushy. And when we look at it from that perspective, it gives us a ballpark. But oftentimes, what the coach perceives training to be is not the same as what the athlete perceives it to be.
Yeah, I think that like bringing that up also points out like that there's an important element there of if we want the sports that we love to develop, we also need to teach our athletes when we're doing it why we're doing it. Like like what is the process that we're doing? Why are we doing these things now? What are we doing next? How does this fit in the plan? Because that's part of how our sports grow, is that they go through that experience and then they can share that, with their next generation and everything else. And it'll improve
Absolutely.
compliance and stuff in the, in the actual training.
Well, yeah, and I think you want to have some degree of autonomy in the athletes, but not so much that the inmates run the asylum.
Uh-huh.
Um, I think as athletes are, elite athletes should have more autonomy than a novice athlete. Um, and when we start to look at that, obviously we want to have some conversations with the athlete. We want their input, but ultimately we have to remember it's our decision to make. We're there to often make athletes do things they don't want to do. I don't know many athletes that want to do a really hard squat session. Very
Yep.
few
Yep.
that are team sport athletes. So we've got to kind of look at the picture of educating why we squat. Why is it important to squat? But also when you tell an athlete that something's going to happen, this is going to happen. You're going to feel this way. It better happen.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
if it doesn't happen that way, you're going to lose that athlete.
hmm It's also gives us a great opportunity as coaches to practice, like, going through the cycles of, like, coaching our athletes to do something. Because when we're in, whether we're in a hypertrophy session or a strength session or a power session, they're probably going to have a barbell in their hands, but what that
Yes.
work should look like and what it should feel like is probably going to be a little different in each one of those sessions. And so, if you got kids who love to go in and just crush themselves, like, that's going to be fine for portions of that training, but for other times it might be counterproductive. And so it's a good opportunity to train the kids to think about, what is it that I'm doing right now? Like, it's one of my favorite things actually about using Olympic lifts and Olympic lift derivatives as a training stimulus, is that by going through a first and second pull and a drop and a catch and learning about the rhythm and the timing and all those kinds of things, you can kind of install new hardware in their brain about the fact that it's like, it's not just hard all the time. There's phases that you're supposed to move through in your sport of, changing efforts and changing focus, and it's really important that we get to practice those, even if they're not, one to one with our sport. If we can think about, how do we interact with our tools, or how do we have the right mind
Yeah.
frame for what we're doing, it's more tools for the athlete.
Yeah. You're educated. They're educated about the training process. And
hmm
I think it's important that the why of what we're doing is explained. In fact, every training session should start with an explanation of why we're doing this training session, what's the goal, what's the focus, and get everybody centered. It's much like leadership dynamics if you think about it.
hmm
Um, and I think that's important. You can also fold that into your, annual training plan. One of the things that I learned when I worked with some collegiate athletes was I better darn well know where exam weeks are
uh-huh.
because they're going to do dumb stuff getting ready for exams. And I better offload the training during that time because of the external stress of studying
Yeah.
and lack of sleep, most likely, because they're going to stay up all night trying to cram. So you've got to also have an understanding of the academics that they're doing outside in your annual training plan. Not that you're going to, you're just going to mark it on your calendar. Up, this is going to be a time period when I need to think about some stuff.
hmm Yep. Um, okay. And then, did we miss anything? Is there anything important that we didn't talk about for periodization?
I think one of the biggest things that frustrate me is there's a growing belief that periodization is dead and we don't need it. And
Yeah.
that we can just use this reactive programming modeling with velocity based training. Um, I don't believe that's going to work, peeps. And the reason I don't is because how do I ensure that the athlete is ready when I need them to be,
hmm
or increase the potential for them to be ready? Just
Yeah.
because I modify training constantly based on their current state doesn't mean they're going to ever practice training when they're fatigued, when they may need to compete when they're fatigued.
Yeah. See, this is something I need to go get a little education, go do some reading. Um, because, I've been in the fitness space for a long time, and I've seen a bunch of people say, this is going to be the new thing, right? And it often ends up becoming a really valuable tool, but it rarely ever has the capacity that was promised early on. So I'm really interested to go read some more about that, and maybe even buy some toys and practice some of it in my little troll cave here. But I'm suspicious that we're going to find out that it turns out it might be a really valuable tool, but not the you know not the be all.
Well, so I always go back to history. In the
Yeah.
1970s, the Russians invented the linear position transducer for weightlifting monitoring.
Yep.
They tried to use it for training. If the Russians bailed on it for weightlifters, tells me something. I mean, because they have a whole university in Moscow dedicated to weightlifting.
Yep.
And
I'm gonna
so
the
if
one
they
bit of
bailed,
pushback, the one bit of pushback I'll give to that, and you can tell me if it's reasonable or not reasonable, is that um, when we design our training, we always make a bunch of assumptions before we start, right? Like we
always,
talked about earlier, right? Like the 7-day cycle or a 5-day cycle or whatever, right? There's a bunch of assumptions that we make, and it's very difficult for institutions to change courses. So the only bit of pushback I'm going to give, and you can tell me if I'm insane or not, is that they might have been entrenched enough that they couldn't steer the ship fast enough to look at how that interacted with the assumptions that they were making. But that might be a crazy thing to say.
well, Carl Miller tried the same thing in the United States in the 1970s, and we bailed on it too.
Yeah.
And then the Germans tried it in the 1990s with the V scope,
Yeah.
trained their whole program on velocity, and they bailed on it too. Mike Stone tried it in the 1990s, and he bailed on it too, because we found that velocity changes before strength. So if we're overreacting to velocity changes, we never get a strength stimulus.
Yeah, I mean that is an interesting dynamic for sure. I
But
again, I
I think
go ahead.
I was going to say I think velocity has its place, but to throw out periodization and say we're just going to train on velocity
Hmm.
is illogical to me because you still have a competition season. You still have goals for the training year. You still have performance benchmarks that need to be achieved at certain times. So velocity based training is simply a programming tactic,
Hmm.
albeit a probably bad programming tactic for anything outside of a speed strength phase. Um, from that perspective, I think you have to think about marrying technology into the periodization process. And I think technology is not going to solve all our problems. It's just going to inform our decision making.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean we definitely, that's the thing that AI might be able to do for us is find, to analyze data and find trends and stuff that might shorten that make that shortcut a little bit more feasible. But yeah, I'm really it's weird to me to think about not periodizing just because of my own training experience. Like it seems like an unintuitive thing, because obviously I trained everything all the time forever at the start, and then that really started to run out of gas, and not even it wasn't even a year, like I started really
Okay.
running into stuff at 8 or 9 months where I was like, I'm just not sharp, like I can't do power work at 100% because I'm just dull, from the last thing
Yeah.
that I was doing.
Well, anything works for a little while.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And well, but the anti-periodization crowd would argue that progressive overload is the solution to periodization. I'm like, but that's a programming tactic used in periodization. It's
Yeah.
the same thing.
Yeah, and it doesn't go forever in every
No.
context, right? Like, I mean, at one point
Well,
I could jump really high. At one point I did a 39.5 inch vertical, and I was very, very proud of that. I had to train very hard to get there. And the amount of effort that I was putting into improving my vertical was, so significant that everything else was taking a back seat, and there wasn't any, I didn't have any legs left when I was done with power work. There
yeah,
wasn't the capacity to go and,
yeah.
progressively overload anymore.
Well, go even more global. I started lifting weights when I was 11. I'm 56. If that's the case, I should be squatting like a gazillion pounds, right? I
Right?
mean, because progressively, it's just going to get better forever. Doesn't work that way.
I need
I
to
wish it
find
did.
some critics and see if they have anything. Like I always, when I hear things like that, I have the psychological bias where sometimes I don't approach it from a place of curiosity and I just think like that's insane and I just move on with my day. And so sometimes I think like maybe I should be a little more open-minded and find out if there is. I mean,
Their argument is that if you read the papers, because there's a few of them out there,
mhm.
is that the original research on periodization is flawed and there's not enough scientific evidence, and that they've got this wacky belief that the general adaptive syndrome was what the periodization modeling is based off of. It is not. General adaptive syndrome is a way to explain what we do in
Uh-huh.
periodization. Periodization existed way before Hans Selye decided to talk about general adaptive syndrome. Um, the reality is that they have a very narrow view of training. And often I have debated some of them at conferences, and their argument has some interesting nuancing to it. But when you get down to the meat of it, they don't train athletes and they work in a lab.
Yeah.
And they lack that ecological kind of validity of actually doing it and understanding that it is very difficult to do a true periodization study. Matviev's work is probably the best because it's the biggest and it could only be accomplished in a communist country.
Yeah, I mean, we are going to run into anytime we're trying to control a large portion of people's lives in, an ecologically diverse environment, it's going to be really difficult to do valid science. Like they might have perfectly valid criticisms that the research isn't perfect, right? I'm sure the research isn't perfect. But that
Far
doesn't mean
from
that
it.
there aren't any takeaways, right? The idea with research is that every study is a request for another study, right? We want to know what can we do better, or like how can we evaluate this, like what
Yes.
controls can we put in place, what environment can we check it in, not just everything in here is useless.
Well, when you ask for an alternative, they can't give you one.
Yeah.
And so, because you don't even have a rationale for what you could do alternatively, so why would this? Until you have an alternative model, this is the best we have.
And we
And
have a lot of well-established physiological, like we know about the repeated bout effect, and we know about, all the, there's reason for us to believe from a physiological signaling point of view, even though we don't have a complete picture of how all of that works yet, we still have enough reason to believe that it would be valuable to have variation in your training approach, right?
there's enough evidence and there's enough meta-analytical data on the available research to let us to believe that a planned, structured approach is better.
Hmm.
I mean, if you just put it in that perspective, I remember being a young graduate student in 1993 in Professor Stone's class, and he used to say, "Random training equals random results." And to be honest, as a young person, you're like, what does he mean? But as an
Hmm.
older, more experienced coach, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Because if you just don't have a focus to what you're doing, how do you expect to get good at it?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that if you adopted that frame of mind, that periodization wasn't worth doing. So, I mostly worked with high school population, and a lot of the kids that I work with are just average athletes, right? But
Yeah.
every once in a while, you get to work with kids who have a really special capacity in some domain,
Yep.
right? And if you had just a single stamp progressive overload program that you ran them through from when you got them as a freshman to when they left as a senior, the amount of progress that I believe that you'd be leaving on the table would be huge. Like to have the kid invest that much time and energy into a sport that they love, and then not to give them, their best chance to success, seems almost like just being a dick.
Well, I think you have to kind of think about, from a framework perspective, if you have the basics done really, really well, you're going to
Mhm.
get your athlete pretty far.
Yeah.
Um, and I think you're going to make nuancing changes to the programming tactics and strategies depending on the athlete's capacities, abilities to adapt.
Hmm.
Now, one of the things I think that people really screw up with periodization is they get this mindset that I'm going to design an annual training plan, and on the 21st of August 2026, you're going to do these exercises, these sets, and these reps. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is we're setting the roadmap, and we're going to plan mesocycle to mesocycle, or two mesocycles to two mesocycles, so that we can be reactive to the athlete's state and informed by the monitoring program.
Hmm.
And I think that's the thing that we have to kind of remember. The annual plan is a roadmap. It doesn't mean, we're not going to turn off and deviate slightly from that roadmap if it's required.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Um,
Because that roadmap is like, I'm going to do a hypertrophy block. It doesn't specify how many pounds they're going to be lifting or how many sets and reps they're going to be
yep,
doing at the end of it, right? It just means that I'm working on bigger athletes for this period.
yep. And the strategy you used is up to you and up to, I mean, my wife had a thrower when she was the throws coach at Appalachian State. He couldn't catch cleans. because his left hand was frozen. So he didn't do cleans. He just did pulls.
Yeah, which is
Still
fine.
got the training adaptation we needed.
Yeah.
So I think you have to kind of look at it from that framework. I think people get really rigid when they start to talk about periodization. And I think this is where coaching eye comes into play. I think this is where technology can help us. I'll be honest though, really good coaches can see it just as fast as the technology does.
Hmm.
I've worked with some amazing coaches that, they have a feel for their athletes, and you're looking at the monitoring data and you're going, yeah, he's right or she's right, Um, and that informs the tactics of programming. I think the big mistake, is conflating programming and periodization.
Hmm.
Um, Periodization, direction; programming, modes and methods, adaptable.
Yep. Yep. I like that. I think we're in a good spot to end. I think that was a pretty holistic view of
I hope
what we should
so.
be thinking about. Yeah. All right. Well,
All right.
thank you very much for being here. Where can people find you at?
They can find me at Edith Cowan University, Master Strength Edition. We actually have a whole course unit in periodization, a whole semester, where we go through all this in much more detail. I'm on Instagram, Doc Haff. I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Blue Sky. Hopefully, towards 2026, we're starting mTOR Strength Sciences. So that'll be a more holistic platform that my wife and I run.
Oh, interesting. That's a name to choose, mTOR.
Oh, that's our weightlifting team, mTOR Weightlifting Club. But mTOR Strength Sciences is my business entity
Okay, cool.
in Australia.
All right. Well, thanks guys so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. If you got more questions about periodization, put them in the comment section. I'll do more videos about periodization. I love talking about training.
Oh,
Right.
periodization, we could talk about it for days.
Yeah, I'm sure. Pretty comfortably. All
Yeah.
right. Thank you so much.
Cheers.